I love sewing for others this time of year, and I bet you do too. So I've rounded up 28 fast and easy gifts that you can sew in 30 minutes or less. This gift guide has gifts for kids, friends, teachers, coworkers, and even gifts for your pet. Whether you're sewing for the holidays, birthdays, or just because, these are the kind of projects that make people say, "You made that?" So clear off your sewing table, grab your fabric scrap, and get ready for a full list of fast, fun, and totally gift-worthy sewing projects you'll want to make again and again. I love these Scrappy Coasters because not only are they gorgeous, but I have a secret method that makes them super fast. These are great for neighbors, friends, and teachers. First, raid your fabric stash for scraps. You can use any size scraps for this project, including really teeny tiny pieces. We are going to be making 1.5 inch squares. So small pieces, big pieces, any kind. And I like to just kind of choose a color theme. You're going to need an acrylic ruler. I like the ones that start at 0 in the corner and have an easy way to find 1.5 inch. I love my rotating cutting mat, rotary cutter, and fusible interfacing, plus a scrap of quilt batting. We're also going to use spray baste for this project. And finally, you'll need a point turner or chopstick. We're going to start by cutting 1.5 inch squares from the fabrics. We need 16 of these for each coaster. If you're cutting from a really small scrap, I like to use my small square rotary cutter. And then for bigger scraps, you can cut strips 1.5 inches wide and then cut them down to smaller squares. Then cut a 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square from a larger piece of fabric. This will be the back of the coaster. Now I'm going to show you how to piece these together without piecing them individually. So grab a piece of lightweight fusible interfacing, and then we're going to put these squares down in a 4x4 grid. The sticky side of your interfacing should be face up. Place the fabric squares face up with the raw edges butting up right against each other. Now use your iron to press down carefully on the grid. We want to press these down just enough to hold them, and then we'll trim the interfacing and continue pressing. Use your rotary cutter to trim off the excess interfacing. Now head back to your iron and press down the squares again just to make sure they're all stuck on the interfacing really well. Now we're going to make our first seam, so fold the first row of squares down and press it with your iron. It should fold easily where the fabrics meet. Now we're going to sew across that fold with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when you open that up, you'll see you just sewed 4 seams all at once. Repeat the process for the other horizontal seams. After you've sewn all 3 of those, we're going to press the seam allowances all to one side. Now we're going to repeat the process with the other seams. These ones will be a bit bulkier because we already have seam allowances in there, so just make sure you press it well to keep it flat. Sew across that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance going right over those other seam allowances. Repeat until you finish all of those seams. Now press those seam allowances all in one direction and then give the whole thing a good press. Now grab your scrap of quilt batting. We're going to spray baste our patchwork to the quilt batting. Make sure you press down really well and then let it dry fully. After it's dry, we're going to top stitch this coaster. I like to top stitch 1/8 inch away from the seams on the side of the fabric that has the seam allowance under it. That way it'll help keep the bulky seam allowance down and it'll just look really good. Top stitch both vertical and horizontal lines, and then we're going to trim off the extra quilt batting. Use a ruler to square up your coaster to 4.5 inches square. Now grab your backing fabric. We are going to do some stay stitching on one side of each of these squares. Stay stitching is just a regular length stitch where your seam allowance is going to be. Since we have to leave an opening in one of the sides, this stay stitching is a little trick to help you get a straight edge when we turn that fabric. Then go ahead and pin the coaster pieces together with the right sides together. Make sure the edges that have the stay stitching are on the same side. Now sew around the edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 1.5 inch opening on the side with the stay stitching. Clip the corners and trim your seam allowance and then turn right side out. Use a chopstick or point turner to push the corners out. If you still need help getting the corners to be the right shape, use a pin to gently grab that fabric inside the seam and pull it out. Now press your coaster really well and then turn the edges of the opening in. You can use that stitching to help you line up the edges perfectly. Now top stitch around the coaster 1/8 of an inch from the edges, pivoting at those corners. When you're done with that step, your coaster is finished. If you are sewing for kids, this I Spy bag pattern is super fun to make. This makes a great quiet bag toy that your kid will love. These are super fun to play with, and the back has a little checklist that you can mark off as you find the pieces inside. Start by printing off the pattern pages. The link to these is listed in the description below. We're going to cut out 2 layers of both your lining and your main fabric from the main pattern piece. For the main pieces, interface the back of them. We're also going to need 2 pieces of tissue paper cut out to the same size, and then the vinyl pieces can be cut with vinyl. Grab some poly pellets or rice for the inside of the bag and a funnel to help us put them in. There are lots of options for the little trinkets you can use inside, but I have a link to these exact ones and other options in my blog post. These are called flatback resin charms, often used for slime. So if you're searching, that's what you can search for. We also need tape and glue, and then your vinyl can be from the home decor section of a fabric store. This is just a clear vinyl, or you can save the bags that sheets come in often have a vinyl that you can recycle. We're going to start by laying one of our main pattern pieces and one of our lining pattern pieces right sides together, and then pinning this main pattern piece right on top of it. We're going to cut out this front cutout, and that'll be a window for our vinyl. So to do this, we're going to pin inside and outside of that line and then cut around it. We won't be using this inside piece, so you don't have to be too careful with the inside fabric, but make sure the outside frame fabric is nice and crisp cut along that dashed line. Once you have that cut, we're going to remove the paper pattern piece and then pin these 2 layers together again. We're going to sew around the inside cutout with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then when you're done with that, clip into the seam allowance at the window corners. We want this to turn nicely, so we're just going to clip and trim a little bit and then turn this by pushing the lining through that window and then pressing as you go. So we're going to turn this right side out so we have a nice outer frame, and this will be where our clear vinyl goes. So once you have that really nice and pressed, grab your piece of clear vinyl and also your glue stick. We don't usually use glue in sewing, but we can't use pins for this part because it will puncture our vinyl. So glue right around that frame and then press your vinyl down, and then we're going to just press around the glue on the other side. So on the front side, give it some heat. That'll help our glue dry. Vinyl can be tricky to sew with, so grab one of your pieces of tissue paper and put that on the back where the vinyl is, and then we're going to top stitch around the frame about 1/8 of an inch from the vinyl. After you've top stitched that, you can peel off your tissue paper. This should come off pretty easy, and then you'll see you have your clear vinyl window front piece. If you have extra vinyl on the edge on the back, you can trim that off. We don't want our little trinkets to get stuck in there. So trim it down to about 1/4 inch. Now we're going to start on the back of our I Spy bag. So place your last 2 main pieces together with the wrong sides together. So you have the main piece face down and the lining face up. Pin these together and then baste around the edge about 1/4 inch from the edges just to hold these together. After we've done that, we're going to place our clear vinyl on the back. This will be a pocket for the trinket list. So use Scotch tape for this, since we again can't pin through the vinyl. We're just going to tape that in place, and the tape will hold it while we sew. And then grab your other piece of tissue paper. The tissue paper helps our machine foot not stick. And then I like to draw, kind of trace that little piece of vinyl so you can know where it is while you're sewing. So I outlined it with a marker, and then I'm just gonna stitch right inside that line to hold the vinyl on. After you've sewn around that to hold on your pocket piece, peel off the tissue paper and the tape. To finish assembling the bag, lay the back main on the front window side with right sides together, and then sew around the I Spy bag with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, leaving about a 3-inch opening for filling. Clip the corners and turn right side out. And then we're gonna give this a good press and top stitch around the outside edge of the bag about 1/8 or 1/4 inch from the edges. If you're pressing over the vinyl, make sure you're using a press cloth so you don't melt it. When you top stitch, make sure you still leave that opening open. Now we're gonna do the funnest part, which is filling up our bag. So grab your funnel and pour in the poly pellets. I used about 3 cups to fill up my bag, and sometimes the pellets get stuck in the funnel, so you might want to use a chopstick to help you push those through. After you've done that, you can put in all the trinkets that you want. I used about 20 and just slip those right in. Now go ahead and top stitch the rest of the opening closed, slip in your list and your marker, and you are ready to give this as a gift. For any sports fan, you have to try this chenille yarn sweatshirt. This is a faux embroidery technique that's super quick and really fun to make. This sewing technique gives you an embroidered sweatshirt look, but it's so easy to make. Make these for football season, game day, or really any occasion. You can use the yarn to write whatever you want, but you can also download the templates for touchdown and game day on my website. You can find chenille yarn at most craft stores. It's a super plush yarn that is typically in a jumbo weight. This is a weight size 6 and this is a size 7. I love the plushiness of the size 7. So if you have a short word or a large shirt, size 7 is my recommendation. Size 6 is a little better for a smaller size shirt or if you're spelling longer words. So grab your yarn and let's get a few more supplies and then we'll get started. Print out the templates from the link in the description below. We're also going to need a blank sweatshirt, the yarn, and this tracing paper set. This is an iron-on transfer pencil and tracing paper, and this is going to help us transfer our design to the sweatshirt so that we can trace it. Cut along the dashed lines of the printable and tape them together to get the full design. If you're creating your own design, use a cursive font and print it out large on a piece of paper. If you can do a mirror image so that it's backwards, that's best, or you can flip the paper over and transfer from the other side. If you want to make your own custom design, you can even just freehand a design onto your sweatshirt. Once your design is ready, grab a piece of tracing paper and put it over the top of your design, and then tape it to the paper and also to the table so that nothing shifts. Start tracing the letters with a heavy hand and then go over the entire design at least 2 times to get a really good amount of that pencil on there. This is a waxy substance that's going to transfer onto the shirt so that we can trace our design. Remove all the tape from the tracing paper and lay this face down on your sweatshirt. Now you can see the design is right side up, and just make sure you have it centered where you want it on your shirt. Use a hot iron to press this gently, piece by piece, so that the wax transfers to the t-shirt. Take a little peek to see if it's working before you take your paper off. If you're using a shirt that's a little bit darker, it may be a little hard to see, but you can see that the wax transferred onto my sweatshirt. Now I'm going to use a darker fabric marker to trace over those words so I can see them a little bit better. Now we're ready to attach the yarn. Head over to your sewing machine and choose a wide zigzag stitch. Place your yarn at the start of your design and lower your presser foot. Now start zigzag stitching over the yarn, curving and stopping and pivoting as you need to create your letters. When you reach a point where the yarn runs into itself, do a back stitch and then trim off that excess yarn and then start over at another point on your design. Keep sewing your yarn on until you've completed the entire design. And then your shirt is ready to wear. For people that are hard to shop for, let's make this cute little pouch that is the perfect size for a gift card. Each pouch requires 5 charm squares, so you can pick 5 from any charm pack or use leftover scraps to cut your own 5-inch squares. And then we're also going to need to cut 3 pieces of interfacing to back 3 of those pieces, so they'll also be 5 by 5. This is a really fun project to use cam snaps on, so if you have a cam snap placer, grab that, or you can use buttons and elastic to make the closure of this pouch. Start by interfacing 3 of your squares. This will be the flap and then the sides of your pouch. And then grab one of those to make the flap. We're going to fold this in half and press, and then sew down both short edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim the corners and trim down that seam allowance. Then turn it right side out and press, making sure to get those corners out. With the other 4 charm squares, we're going to make the sides of the pouch. So each set of 2 should have 1 interfaced piece and 1 not interfaced piece. Grab your first pairing and stick the flap up at the top centered, and then pin the fabrics together so that they are sandwiching the flap inside, and make sure you pin all the way around. Now we're going to sew around this, leaving a 2-inch opening at the bottom and making sure we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance so that we don't sew over the side of the flap. Trim the corners and then turn right side out. Now we're going to press this well and make sure that we get the bottom edges where the opening is lined up. Repeat the same process with the other 2 pieces to create another side with no flap. Now we're going to place these together with the sides that we want to be on the outside of our pouch facing together. And then line them up along the side edges and top and bottom. We're going to make sure the bottom openings are both at the bottom so that we can close them while we sew it together. Now we're going to sew them together along the sides and the bottom using a 1/4 inch on the sides but a 1/8 inch on the bottom. That way we'll close those openings. Don't worry about clipping the corners or anything. We're just going to turn this right side out. Our seam allowance is finished, so it'll be really nice inside, and the seam allowance will also make the bottom edges a little bit rounded, which is cute. Press your pouch really well, and then we're going to place our cam snap. So fold the top flap over and then pick out a fun cam snap. I like to do kind of a contrasting color. Use a ruler to find the center of the flap and then put your snap about a 1/2 inch up from that edge of the flap. Place your snaps, and then once you have the first one, I like to push it really hard down where it's going to go, and then it'll kind of make a little mark. So I can use a marker to mark that point, and that's where I'll place my second one. After you have that second one in, your little snap pouch is done, and it is so cute. These are fun to snap. Great for gift cards, money, or little treasures. Now I'll show you how to do the button one. We're going to use a little bit of ribbon for this, 1/8 inch elastic, and a big button. So you can decide where you want your button to be on the pouch. I like it to be maybe a 3/4 inches from the edge of the flap. And then you'll need a little piece of elastic that is big enough to stretch around that. And then just 3/4 inches of a little piece of gross grain ribbon. This will just cover our elastic. So to do this, we're just going to make a loop with the elastic and put that ribbon right on top and pin it. The ribbon will cover the edges and also help us to keep that elastic from slipping out. Sew over the ribbon a few times with a pretty narrow stitch length. That'll keep our elastic in place. Now fold the flap down and put the button at the bottom of the elastic loop and sew that on. I love cam snaps, but I love the look of a big button. So this is a really fun project to use one of those cute buttons that you have been stashing. Anyone could use this project. This is a lavender sachet that will sweeten the smell of a gym bag, locker, or drawer. Click the link in my description to get the templates for this. We are going to need 2 colors of fabrics, one for the main and one for the side. Also a funnel for filling it, and dried flowers. First, back your fabric with lightweight fusible interfacing. Then we're going to sew the side to the main piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Put those pieces together, right sides together, and sew down that side. Now press the seam allowance toward the side piece, and then use your fun stitches to sew along the side piece right along that seam. You can use other stitching or quilting on the rest of this if you want. This is just to give it a little extra fun. Now give that a quick press and then fold it in half, and then we're going to sew this together around the edge, leaving a 1 inch opening on one of the short edges. After you've sewn that, trim the seam allowances, clip the corners, and then turn right side out and press. Before we fill this up, I like to make sure my corners are all turned out really well, and then the opening is pressed under how I want it. So press that under a 1/4 inch to line up with the rest of the side there, and then we're going to fill it up. Use your funnel or a rolled up piece of paper to pour the petals into the sachet until it is as full as you want it. I like to fill it up about 3/4 full. Now just top stitch along that edge to close up the opening, and your sachet is finished. Any gift could use an extra little touch of handmade, and these fabric gift bows are reusable and super cute. I love projects that I can use again and again, and these fabric gift bows are so cute. They are set on elastic so you can stretch them around different size gifts, and this is a super special way to finish a present. Grab the templates from the link in the description below, and these are going to be our pieces for the bow. We're going to start with strips 2.5 inches wide and then cut them down to the length of the pattern pieces. We'll need 3 size large, 3 medium, 2 small, and 1 extra small. Give these a good press and then press in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together. Then we're going to sew these all together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to chain piece them so that it's faster, and then clip them apart. Now we are going to use a safety pin to clip onto the side of the tube and push through to turn the tube right side out. Repeat until all your tubes are turned right side out, and then press well. Now we're going to start creating our little shapes for our bow. So we're going to create a figure 8 shape and then pin in the middle, starting with the largest pieces. Do this for all the pieces except for the smallest one. Now we're going to sew down the middle to keep that figure 8 shape in place, and backstitch if you can. Then trim off any of that extra fabric that you see hanging off of your pieces. Now we're going to stack our pieces up to create the bow, starting with the biggest piece and stacking to the smallest. This will kind of create a little snowflake shape, and then just use a hot glue gun to keep these in place as you build your bow. Once you get to that last little piece, you can either sew or glue this into a loop, and then put the loop in the center of the bow to finish it off. Check your bow to make sure everything is in place, and if you need to add some more glue, now's a good time to do it. And then grab a piece of fold over elastic. For smaller gifts, I recommend 20 inches. For a larger gift, maybe 36. You can really do any size for this. We're just going to glue this in a circle so that the bow is on an elastic loop, kind of like a really huge headband. And this will be used to just wrap it around your presents. For the reader in your life, let's make this corner bookmark. It is so fast and would be a great gift to give with a book. These bookmarks slip right over the corner of your book's pages to hold your spot. This project requires only scraps, and you can use up to 3 different prints for it. You'll need a sturdy, fusible interfacing. I'm using Heat and Bond Craft Extra Firm. And then you can print off the template from my website or use a ruler and a rotary cutter. So the first step is to cut 3 squares that are 4.5 inches wide by 4.5 inches wide. You will also need 2 pieces of interfacing that are the same measurement. We're going to cut 1 1/2 diagonally, so find a longer ruler and cut along the diagonal. We are going to use one of these triangles for the triangle part of the bookmark. So find the fabric that you want to use for that. Then we're going to line up the interfacing at one of the corners of the triangle square and fuse it on. Once you've done that, we're going to press this fabric into a triangle right over that interfacing. So fold up that loose corner up to the top corner. Press well, and then we're going to top stitch on that fold at 1/8 of an inch. Now grab the fabric you want to be on the front of the bookmark underneath the triangle and fuse the square interfacing to it. Now we're going to sew all these pieces together. So put your triangle on top of that main fabric and line it up in the top right corner. Find your backing fabric and put it on that stack. Pin it in place, and now we're going to sew around the square, leaving about 1 inch open on one of the sides that doesn't have the triangle. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then clip the corners and trim the seam allowance down. Turn it right side out, and then we're going to press it really well. Press the bookmark well, making sure to focus on the seam allowance where the opening is. Then top stitch all the way around the bookmark at 1/8 inch. Make this easy Kindle cover. It has a microfiber lining so it cleans your Kindle every time you store it. For this tablet cover, you can download the pattern piece from my website. The link is in the description below. We're going to need a fat quarter of cotton cloth that you can find at the dollar store, and then microfiber cloth. We're going to line it with this, and this way it'll keep our screen super clean every time we put it away. I found the microfiber in the auto section of the dollar store. And then we're also going to need lightweight fusible interfacing. Let's get started by fusing the interfacing to the back of the cotton fabric. Use the pattern piece to cut 2 layers from the fabric and 2 layers from the microfiber. If you prefer to use measurements instead of the pattern piece, you can pause the screen now. The measurement is 8.5 inches by 6.25 inches. And this is designed to fit a Kindle Paperwhite that's about 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and it will fit other tablets about the same size too. After you've done that, we're gonna sew 1 piece of cotton fabric to 1 piece of microfiber with the right sides together, sewing along the top edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat with the second piece so you have 2 of these. Open them up and press the seam allowance toward the cotton fabric. And then we're going to top stitch along that cotton about 1/8 of an inch from the seam. This top stitching will help keep our Kindle cover aligned correctly with the microfiber lining inside. Place the 2 pieces together with right sides together, matching the cotton on the cotton side and the microfiber on the microfiber side. Pin all the way around and sew the edges, pivoting at the corners and leaving 1 to 2 inches open in the microfiber lining. You can use a zigzag stitch on the microfiber to prevent stretching as you're sewing. Clip the corners before you turn this, and then turn right side out through your opening. Press well and then stitch the opening closed. Then you can push the lining inside your tablet sleeve. Give that a final press, and then you're ready to slip in your Kindle or tablet. These sleep masks are super fun for sleepovers, new moms, and anyone who could use a little extra sleep. Download the sleep mask pattern on my website. You can get the link in the description below. And then we're going to cut out 1 layer with each of our fabrics, 1 layer of lightweight fusible interfacing, and 1 layer of batting. This is reversible, so make sure you pick 2 cute fabrics. We're also going to need fold over elastic. You can also use stretchy lace elastic for this if you have that instead. Cut this down to 14 inches. Now we're going to fuse the interfacing to the back of one of our fabric pieces. And then lay that piece right on top of your batting, lining up all those edges. The right side of your fabric will be facing up. Now grab your template and mark where the elastic goes. There are marks on the sides. And we're going to pin the elastic right on top of that. The elastic is going to be inside our sleep mask as we sew it together. So put the second piece of fabric right side down on top of that, making kind of a sandwich, and then pin all around your sleep mask. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 1.5 or 2 inch opening at the top of the mask. The top is the straightest part, so that's easiest to close. And then go ahead and trim your seam allowance and clip the corners. I like to use pinking shears, and then you can turn it right side out, making sure to press out all those curves. Focus on the top of the sleep mask, making sure that closure is nice and smooth, and then press and pin that in place. Sew around the mask 1/8 inch from the edges to finish. I love this woven pot holder, and it would be a fun gift to give anybody, especially a hostess. This project uses lots of scraps with a cool woven technique that you will have so much fun making. This is a great way to use up strips, but also so fun and so creative. This is an improv project. We are just gonna start sewing. So take your strip and press over about 1/4 inch. And just to clarify, the strips can be as wide or as thin as you want. So you can use leftover binding strips, strips that you've cut, or just little pieces of fabric that you can create a strip with. So on one side, we're gonna fold over 1/4 inch, and then the other side will fold over about 3/4 inch. Depending on how wide your strip is, you can adjust these as needed, but we need to just fold over both edges. Now we're going to fold that strip over again. This will give us a nice finished edge. None of the edges are going to be raw. And then take it to your sewing machine. We're going to sew close to that edge, about 1/8 inch. That way we're going to have a line of stitching through the middle of this strip. Give that a good press, and then we're going to cut this down to about 8 inches. So we really need the strips to be at least 7 inches, but I like to have just a little extra to give me some wiggle room, and then keep making strips with different fabrics. Once you have about 14 to 16 strips of different widths and lengths, we are going to start assembling our pot holder. Cut 2 layers of batting and 2 layers of fabric 7 inches square, and we're going to make a sandwich with the fabric on the outside and the batting on the inside. Pin these together and then baste with a wide stitch length all the way around to keep them together. Now we're going to start weaving our fabrics to create this cool effect. This is the funnest part of this project. So just grab your fabrics one at a time and stack them on top of the pot holder. Start by covering the top of the pot holder with horizontal strips. Once you have finished that, we're going to start by lifting up every other strip. Then we'll slide a vertical strip in there and lay the fabrics back down. Carefully realign the fabrics between each new strip, and then for the next one, we're going to lift up the opposite of what we just did. If you did weaving on a loom as a kid, this is very similar. And then just keep repeating this process until you have covered the pot holder with the vertical strips. Once the squares underneath are totally covered with weaving, we are going to pin these in place very carefully. We just want to keep our pattern so that we can take it to our sewing machine and baste it on. Once you are ready, we are going to take this to the sewing machine and just baste on all those layers. I like to sew on the top of all of the weaving, but that makes it a little bit hard to see the bottom layer, so you can kind of feel around for it and make sure you're basting all those fabrics together. When you're done, you can remove all those pins, and we're going to trim this from the back so that we can see what we're trimming. So grab your rotary cutter and ruler, and we're going to trim along the square's edges. Once you're done with that, you're going to see how this pot holder is taking shape. Check your basting, make sure all of those edges got caught up in it. And then we're going to make a loop for the back of our pot holder. I'm just using an extra strip. This is a little wider than a typical loop, but I'm gonna pin it about 1 inch from one of the corners and then leave it there while I attach the binding. I'm gonna bind this the way I bind a quilt by sewing the binding onto the front of my pot holder. To start it, I'm gonna turn my binding into a triangle shape that will give me a nice edge that I don't have to finish later. Sew the binding on 3/8 inches from the edge. When you are about 3/8 inches from the next edge, we're going to stop and pivot the pot holder. Fold the fabric of the binding up along the diagonal so it matches the other edge of the quilt. This will create a triangle under the fabric, and then we're just going to keep sewing right over that 3/8 inch from the edge. Keep attaching your binding until you get back to where you started. Once you do get back to that original triangle,
Continue sewing the binding on until you have passed your original start point, and then create another triangle with a binding to finish it off. Trim off your excess binding, and then we're going to use a hand needle and thread to sew the binding to the back of the potholder using an invisible stitch or a slip stitch. When you get to a corner, fold it over and tuck the lower layer into the corner. The fabric will kind of show you what to do with this, so work with it and you'll create a diagonal going into that corner. You can stitch down that corner to help secure it if you want. When you get to the loop, continue sewing, making sure you're getting the loop and the back of the potholder in your stitches. When you are finished, you will have the coolest potholder ever. I love the three-dimensional effect of this, and it's such a fun way to use up so many pretty scraps.
This puff pillow project is the coziest gift, and you only need a charm pack to get started. Start by choosing 25 charm squares to use. If you don't have charm squares, you can cut your own. They're 5-inch squares. The charm pack I'm using is called Flower Power, and I love the retro vibe of it. And then you'll also need the same amount of base squares. These are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. To start making these puff blocks, we're going to need one base square and one main square. Match the corners of the large square with the corners of the small square underneath. And then when you do this, you'll see that there is some fabric billowed up in between those two corners. So we're going to make a little pleat with that. It'll be about 1/4 inch, and you can just pinch that extra fabric, center the pleat, and pin it in place. This is how we're going to get that puff effect with the extra fabric. So keep doing that. We're going to complete the pleats on 3 sides of this square, leaving one open without a pleat. Now take this block to your sewing machine and sew those 3 edges that you pleated. Make sure you backstitch at the ends of the stitching since we're going to be handling this block a lot. We don't want that stitching to come loose. So we left one open, and we're just going to keep doing this until we have all 25 squares ready to go. To start assembling the pillow, we are going to grab 5 squares and sew these together in a row. Make sure all the open sides of the squares are facing in the same direction up. We don't want to sew those together yet. So we're going to sew all the side seams together in a row to complete this. And I like to lay all 25 of my squares out to make sure I have the colors where I want them, and then just take one at a time with the sewing machine so I don't lose my place. Keep sewing rows of 5 together until you've used all of your blocks. You'll have 5 rows, so this panel will be a grid 5 by 5. Now we're going to start stuffing and sewing our rows together. So we're going to start at the bottom and start stuffing your puffs. I just grab a small little piece of the stuffing and stick it in there. You can kind of decide how puffy you want your pillow to be. You don't want it to be so puffed that you can't sew it though, so be careful not to overstuff. And once it's stuffed, we're gonna just pinch that last pleat and pin it in place. This will be a little bit trickier now that you have stuffing inside, but go ahead and put a pin in it to hold the stuffing there and also to hold the pleat down while we sew it. Continue stuffing all 5 of your blocks in the row and pinning the pleats in place. Once you have all 5 stuffed and pinned, take this to your sewing machine and sew the pleats in place, just with one line of stitching all the way down. Now we're going to take the second row and pin the sewn edge to the stuffed row that we have, leaving the open edges still open on the other side. So pin these at the intersections of the seams between each block. Push one of the seam allowances to the left and one to the right so that we get a less bulky seam. And then take this to the sewing machine and sew those together. We're still using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to continue that same process, stuffing row 2 and then sewing row 3 to it, and then continuing until we have all 5 rows stuffed and sewn. After the first 4 rows are done and your 5th row is sewn on but not stuffed, we're just going to finish by stuffing that up, pinning the pleats and sewing it, and that will complete our front panel. That will be the front of the pillow. We'll do a simple envelope closure on the back of the pillow. We're going to cut 2 pieces of fabric that measure 26 by 20 and fold them in half so they are 20 by 13 with a fold. Now we'll pin one on one side of the pillow with the right sides together. Make sure the folded edge is on the inside of the pillow, not on the outside edge. Now sew those 3 sides with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have that one on, we are going to sew the other one in the same way, overlapping the folded edge with the folded edge of the other side. This will give us an opening to stick a pillow form inside our pillowcase. Sew that on, making sure to backstitch near the folded edge of that yellow fabric. And then you can turn this right side out, push those edges out, give it a quick press, and insert your pillow form. This is seriously the coziest pillow. I know I'm gonna be making more of these because my kids are gonna fight over it, but this will look super cute on a couch as a statement pillow, and it pairs perfectly with the puff quilt. I'll leave the link below for that too. This patchwork envelope clutch is the perfect gift for women or teens, and it's a great gift to give with toiletries, makeup, or other fun knickknacks that you can put inside. You can download the pattern for this on my website. It is free and prints out on 6 pages that you'll have to tape together. You'll have to trim off the edges, and these will overlap about 1/2 inch, and then tape them together to create your pattern piece. You'll need 16 charm squares for this. I'm using charm squares from this line called Pivot. You'll also need a button and batting for quilt batting, lightweight interfacing, also spray based. To get started, we're gonna make a panel that is big enough for our pattern piece. In this case, a grid of 4 squares by 4 will be big enough for the envelope clutch pattern. So we're gonna sew 16 charm squares together in rows of 4 with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So start by sewing 4 rows of 4. Once you've done that, we're going to turn them over and press the seam allowances of each row in opposite directions. So the bottom row I'm pressing to the left, the 3rd row I'm pressing to the right, and so forth. That way we can nest our seams and reduce the bulk of our seam allowances. Flip them over again, and now we're going to sew these together. When you put the 2 rows together, those seam allowances will butt up next to each other. That way you'll be able to keep your rows straight and also your points sharp. Continue until you've sewn all 4 together to create your panel. Now press well, and then we're gonna back with interfacing. For the interfacing, I like to just roll it right off the bolt and press and then trim away the excess. When you're interfacing a panel like this with seam allowances, I like to also press from the back just to make sure the heat gets through those bumps. Now grab your batting, and we're going to use spray base to attach a layer of batting to the back. The batting will help us get a really quilted patchwork look, so make sure you don't skip the batting on this project. Now use your sewing machine to top stitch the layers, creating a pretty quilting pattern and keeping the layers together. You can sew straight lines or freestyle stitch. I sewed about 1/4 inch on both sides of each seam, and that's a simple way to get a really pretty finish on top. Now we're going to use this panel to cut out a pattern piece with the envelope clutch. We're also going to use the pattern piece to cut one lining from a whole piece of fabric. So I'm going to place this down below and cut both layers at the same time. Make sure you cut out the little notches on the envelope clutch too. This will be important for assembly. To assemble the envelope clutch, we're going to fold up at the notch, matching the notch edges together, and then pin that in place. This is the kind of side of the envelope that comes into the middle. And then we're going to repeat on the other side. This will look a little funky, but it will come together nicely. So pin that in place, and then sew those 2 edges using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and back stitching at the ends of your stitching. After you've stitched it, you can turn this right side out, and there are 2 options for this little centerpiece. If you want that little piece up there, like some envelopes, they have a little flap that overhangs, you can leave it. Otherwise, you can cut that off and make a more clean looking envelope clutch. So I'm going to cut mine off, just lining up where the edges meet. Clip that little piece off, and we'll repeat that with the lining later. So after you've done that, you have your main piece of the envelope clutch ready. We're going to repeat the same thing we just did, stitching with the lining, And since I already cut off the flap, I'm just going to use that piece that I cut off to measure how much I need to cut off from the lining piece. When you sew up the sides of the lining, leave an opening in one of the sides that will let us turn it later. So I like to leave about 2 or 3 inches right on one of those side edges. Now we're going to sew these together. So leave your main piece right side out and keep your lining inside out. We have our little opening there to turn. We're going to place the main patchwork panel of the envelope clutch inside the lining and then line up all the edges, including the flap. Pin all the way around that opening, and then we are going to sew the opening all the way around. We have an opening left in the lining, so don't worry about leaving any space there. Now use the points of your scissors to notch out the part of the envelope clutch where these two pieces meet. And then we want to trim and clip or use pinking shears along the curved edge. That way we'll get a nice smooth edge when we turn it right side out. Find the hole you left in the lining and use that to pull your clutch right sides out. And then press this really well. We want to make sure the lining is not peeking out from the edges of the envelope clutch. So make sure you pull that lining in as you press. Use your sewing machine to top stitch that opening closed. Then finish pressing the lining all the way into the clutch and line up the corners in the inside of the clutch. If you want, you can top stitch around the opening of the envelope clutch. I think this helps keep the lining in place and also looks pretty. Now we're going to attach the button. So create a buttonhole using your buttonhole attachment. I'm going to leave a link in the description. If you've never used one of these before, it's actually pretty easy. Your machine probably came with one. To open this buttonhole, we're going to use a seam ripper, but we want to make sure we don't cut through the ends of the buttonhole. So use 2 pins to kind of block the end and protect the ends of the buttonhole, and then open that with a seam ripper. Fold your flap over and place the button at the bottom of the buttonhole, and then use a fabric marker to just mark that spot where we want to sew the button on. Sew that on and then give your clutch a final press and it is ready to use. I love this project so much. I think it will make any outfit pop. And how fun will this be for a Christmas gift this holiday season? Here's a great stocking stuffer. These cord keepers keep tangled cords together and can be a fun gift to give with some new technology that comes with a cord. I love this project because you can use some really tiny scraps for it. Grab your scrap bin and pick out a few fabrics. You can also print the downloadable pattern on my website. The link is in the description below, and this has 3 different sizes. You'll also need fusible interfacing and Velcro or cam snaps. Start by cutting out 2 layers of interfacing big enough for the pattern size you want to use. Then fuse these to the back of your fabric. Pin your pattern piece to the fabric with the interfacing on the back and cut out 2. Then place your 2 layers together, right sides together. Pin together and sew around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Leave about 1 inch open on one of the straight edges. Trim and clip the curved edges or use pinking shears to reduce the bulk along the curves. Once you're done with that, you can turn this right side out through the opening that you left. Press well and top stitch around the cord keeper 1/8 of an inch from the edges. Now we're going to add our closure. If you're using Velcro, you just need about 3/4 inch to 1 inch of Velcro. And then we're going to sew 1 piece on each side of the Velcro so that when we loop it around, it will close and keep our cord together. Stitch around each rectangle of Velcro and clip your threads. And then you are ready to wrap. If you are using cam snaps, I'm going to show you how to place these. You'll need a cam snap placer, and these sets usually come with an awl to help us make the hole. So you'll need 2 backs and then 1 innie and 1 outie piece for the snaps. Start by poking a hole in the cord keeper with the awl, and then you can stick one of the backs with the pokey thing in to that hole and pop it out, and then stick one of the other sides on it. And then just hold it there while you put it into the snap placer. The back side goes on the black part, and then either the innie or outie goes on to the clear side. And then you're just going to pinch it really hard, and then a metal thing is going to go down and crush the plastic so that it stays on. Then you're going to repeat this with the other one, making sure that you're placing the pieces on the correct side. You don't want these to both be pointing in the same direction. So there will only be one back on each side of your cord keeper. That way it'll loop around, and I always like to check it by turning my cord keeper into the shape that it'll be when it's on the cord, just to check. Now you can wrap it around. These little ones are great for earphones, and these will make your cord drawer easy to navigate and so organized. You can also put multiple cam snaps on to make these adjustable for different cord sizes. This fabric bookmark only requires a few scraps and ribbon, and it is so cute and easy to make. Both bookmark styles use the same size pattern piece. This is 2.5 inches by 7.5 inches, or you can print the pattern from my website. Now just find a few pieces of fabric that will fit this pattern piece, and you can use 2 different fabrics or just one. If you have pinking shears, keep those handy. This will be a great tool. We also will use lace elastic for one of the versions, and the other version we will use grosgrain ribbon. This is 3/8 inch. And finally, we will need some fusible interfacing. Start by cutting 2 pieces of interfacing that are big enough for the pattern template. I like to interface my fabric before cutting out the templates, that way I get a nice crisp edge. Fuse the interfacing to the back of your fabrics, and then cut out 2 layers, one from each of your fabrics using the pattern piece. For the ribbon bookmark, we're going to cut 2 pieces of ribbon about 5 inches long, and then clip the ends at a 45-degree angle to reduce fraying. Stack the ribbons together and then fold them in half and pin upside down on one side of the bookmark. We want them to be facing down so that when we sew this together, they will be on the outside of the bookmark. Pin the 2 layers together, and then we're going to sew around the bookmark, pivoting at each corner. And we're going to leave a small opening about 1 inch long on one of the long sides. Clip the corners with your regular sewing scissors, and then use pinking shears to reduce the bulk of the seam allowance. Turn the right sides out and press well. Then top stitch around the bookmark 1/8 of an inch from the edges, closing the opening as you sew. The construction of the elastic bookmark is exactly the same, except we're going to use an 11-inch piece of stretchy lace elastic. Pin it centered in between the 2 layers of fabric. Match up the edges and pin, then sew around the bookmark just like you did with the other one, leaving a small opening. Then press, avoiding pressing the elastic so you don't melt it, and top stitch around, again avoiding that elastic, and making sure to close the opening as you sew. Once you're done, give it a final press, and this is ready to use. Let's make a reading glasses case. This is super easy and great for anyone who loses their reading glasses. Download the pattern piece for the glasses case. The link is in the description below. And then we're going to use it to cut out 2 curved pieces, one from the main fabric and one from the lining. Then cut one of each fabric without the curved flap. Interface the back of the main fabrics. Start by sewing the main pieces together with right sides together along the bottom and side edges, and repeat with the lining fabrics. Leave a really small opening on one of the sides of the lining. Clip the corners and then turn the lining fabric right side out. Use a chopstick or turning tool to help you, and then slide this into the main fabrics. The main fabric will be inside out and the lining will be right side out, and that way the right sides of the fabric will be facing each other. So match up the flap and then the other side of the opening, and then we're going to sew the flap and opening using a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. You're going to have to pivot when you move from the flap to the other side, and it's helpful to clip into the seam allowance just a little bit right where those 2 points meet. That way you can get your stitching around it. Once you have sewn that, we're going to use pinking shears to reduce the bulk of the curve before turning it right side out. Now turn everything right side out through the opening that you left in the lining. Before we push the lining into the main fabric, we are going to make sure all the corners and curves are pushed out well. Press really well, and then we're gonna sew over that opening on the lining. Once you've top stitched that, we can push the lining into the main fabric. Once you have that in there, press the flap area super well, making sure you get the opening all straight and aligned. Focus on the corner where the flap meets the other side of the opening. And then we're going to put the cam snap in. Decide where you want the cam snap to go on the flap, and then poke through the awl so that it pokes the other fabric too and mark that dot. And then we're going to place the first snap into the flap, then use the purple mark to place the snap onto the glasses case where the flap will meet it. Once you have both snaps, you're ready to use this. So stick your glasses into the case and then snap the flap over the top. This will help you not lose your reading glasses and will protect from scratches. A mug cozy is a perfect coworker gift. You can gift this with a mug or with a gift card. It is so fun to make and uses lots of scraps. For this next project, we are going to use lots of little tiny scraps. So dump out your scrap bin and we are going to cut pieces 1 inch by about 5 inches. I am using a 5.5 inch ruler and then I'm just cutting along the 1 inch mark. So my pieces are 5.5 inches long by 1 inch and I'm cutting about 20 of these. So just keep cutting. This is a really kind of mindless task, so it's kind of fun to put on a movie while you cut these. And once you have about 18 to 20, we'll go to the next step. Now we're going to take all of these to the sewing machine and just sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to sew these together in strips of 2 and then sew the 2s together into 4 and so on until they're all connected. You can put these strips in any order. You don't really have to pay attention to the order as you go. Just keep sewing them together until they are all in one panel. Once you have that done, you can see how gorgeous this is going to be. So pull out your ironing board and we are going to press all the seam allowances in one direction. Give it a good press on both sides before the next step. Now fuse this panel to a piece of lightweight fusible interfacing. This will give it some stability before we start sewing it. And then we're going to layer a piece of quilt batting with spray base right behind the panel and the interfacing. At this point you can trim off the extra batting so that it is not in our way. While we wait for the quilt basting to set, we're going to start working on the elastic. So I'm using 1/8 of an inch braided elastic and cutting an 8-inch strip. This elastic is so tiny that sometimes it'll slip through your stitches. So we are going to use just a scrap of fabric. Mine is interfaced, and we're going to kind of make this into a tab that will protect our elastic from slipping out of our project. So fold your elastic into a loop, and then we're going to center this in the middle of the little scrap and just stitch over it a few times with a really small stitch length. I put mine down to 1.8 millimeters and then just sew over it a few times to keep that secure. Now our quilt base should be dry, so we're going to take this to the sewing machine and give it some top stitching lines. I like to sew on top of the seam allowance, so whichever direction you pressed your seam allowances, I like to sew on top of where that seam allowance ended up, just about 1/8 of an inch from the seam, and this gives it a nice cute stripe quilted look. When you're done with that, it is looking so good, and we're going to use this panel to cut one main piece from the mug cozy pattern. I like to use flathead pins so that I can use a rotary cutter and acrylic ruler for straight pattern pieces like this one. I just find that I get a crisper edge with a rotary cutter versus scissors. Now we can start assembling the mug cozy. So cut a piece of lining fabric with your main pattern piece and then grab your button and elastic. We're going to place the elastic on the edge of our mug cozy. We want the elastic tab, the fabric part, to be outside of our seam allowance range. So it has to be within 1/4 inch, which is our seam allowance, or it can even hang over. I trimmed mine down just a little bit, but this is actually going to be in the inside of the mug cozy, preventing that elastic from ripping out. So make sure that is either hanging off or within the 1/4 inch, and then place the lining on top and pin all around. Now we're going to sew around this all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving about 1 inch or 2 opening on one of the long edges. And then go ahead and clip your corners before we turn this, but don't clip that elastic tab. Now turn it right side out, making sure to push out the corner points. Find your opening and then press that down. We're going to make sure to press the entire project really well, pin that opening, and then we're going to top stitch around the mug cozy 1/8 of an inch from the edges. Once you're done with that, the last step is to sew on your button. So you can try this onto your mug to see where to put the button, or just do about 3/4 inch from the other edge of the mug cozy. Depending on the size of your button, if your button's larger, you're gonna wanna put it in a little bit more than that. So sew that on by hand, and then your cozy is done. Now you can wrap the cozy around your mug. The elastic goes through the handle and over the button, and this will keep your hands nice and comfortable this winter when you have a hot drink in your mug. This is a great gift for teachers or coworkers. Give it with a new mug or a gift card to a drink place. Fabric key fobs are so fun, and I will show you how to put in that hardware. This is great for a new driver or anyone who loses their keys. The pattern printable has two versions, the plain straight version and also a bow version with kind of a gathered wrist strap. So I'm going to show you how to make that one. The plain version is assembled the same way, just omitting the bow. So I'm picking two fabrics, one for the main, one for the bow. We also need a key fob hardware and key fob placer. If you don't have a key fob placer, you can use pliers. We're going to cut out 2 layers of each pattern piece, and I like to interface before cutting. Now pin the main pieces together with the right sides together, and we're going to sew on either edge 1/4 inch from each edge, leaving the short edges open. We're also going to sew the bow pieces together all the way around the curves, leaving a little opening on one side. Turn the main piece right side out using a turning tool to help you. Before you turn the bow piece right side out, clip the curved edges or use pinking shears to reduce the bulk and clip and notch those curves. This will help it lie a little bit flatter and be a little bit nicer. Now we're going to press both pieces well and then top stitch both the main and the bow 1/8 of an inch from the edges. With the bow piece, you can just close the opening or top stitch all the way around, whichever you decide. Now to assemble, grab your main piece and fold it in half, matching the short edges, and then take it to your sewing machine and just sew these together to hold them. Now grab your key fob hardware. I like to kind of place these into the key fob placer, and you're going to center that fabric right in there and crunch it really hard with the key fob pliers. Now grab your bow piece, and you can just manually tie this into a knot along the top of the key fob, and that will gather the fabric a little bit. And just make sure it's really tight, and your key fob is ready to use. If you have a cat lady on your list, this gift is so cool. It is a fabric fish-shaped cat toy that has a crinkle material inside so that it makes noise, and your cat will love to play with it. Print out the pattern from my website and the link in the description below, and then cut 2 layers. You can use different fabrics and make sure they are interfaced. That will give the fish toy a little bit extra protection against your cat's claws. You can either use a sensory crinkle material that is made for sewing for this project, or you can just grab a chip bag and clean out the inside. We're going to use the inner or smaller fish template to cut 2 layers of the chip bag or crinkle material, and we want it to be smaller so that it can fit right inside of that toy but still be able to move around and crinkle. Set the chip bag pieces aside for now, and then we are going to sew the front and back fish toy together with the right sides together using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to leave a 2 to 3 inch opening on the straight edge of the fish's tail. Once you've sewn that, you can clip into the corners and trim your seam allowance down. If you have pinking shears, those are really handy, especially around the curves, but if not, just make sure you clip and notch the curves pretty well. Now turn the fish right side out and press, making sure you get all those curves pulled out. And then when you get to the opening on the tail, fold that under to match the line of the tail and press that well. Now grab your crinkle material, line up the noses of your fish and push them into your fabric fish. And we're going to make sure those are all the way in, and then tack them down between the fish body and the tail using just a little stitch and back stitch. And then sew the opening at the tail closed to finish your toy. By tacking it down, you'll make sure the crinkle material doesn't get loose, and you'll still be able to hear your fish toy. Dog bandanas are so cute and a great accessory. You can make this to go with your family photos or gift it to anyone with a puppy or dog. This bandana is the cutest accessory for your dog. It's easy to make, and it's also reversible. The bandana slips right over your dog's collar, making it super easy to wear. Download the free templates at the link in the description below. This bandana comes in 5 sizes for small to large dogs. It's going to print on 2 pages, so just trim off the dashed line on one of the pages and tape it together. Cut out the size you want, and then we'll collect the rest of our supplies. This project requires just a little bit of scraps. You can get 1/4 yard cuts or even use fat quarters. So we'll need one for the main and one for the reversible side. This is a reversible bandana, so pick 2 fabrics that you love. Cut out one from each fabric. If you want, you can fuse lightweight fusible interfacing to the back of one of these fabrics for a little more stability. Now place your fabrics right sides together. We're going to sew across the top with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now flip that open and press, and then we're going to top stitch along one of the edges, catching the seam allowance underneath. At the sides, fold under 1/4 inch and press. Do this twice so you have a clean finish. Stitch in place really close to the edge of the fabric, and then repeat on the other side. Once you've done that, we're ready to fold the bandana over, matching the bottom points. Pin along the raw edges. Now we're going to sew along the sides, starting at the finished side edge. Pivot at the point and sew back up to the other side. Backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitching lines. Then clip the seam allowance near the point. Turn the bandana right side out through the opening. Use a chopstick to get the points turned, and then press it to get the edges flat. Now we're going to make a casing for the collar to go through. This will be done at the top of the bandana. So first, use a chalk marker or fabric pen to draw a line about 2 inches from the top of the bandana, right where the opening of the bandana starts. I like to pin along that and then top stitch over that line. Now you have a casing that you can thread your collar through, and your bandana is all finished. This little pouch holds a roll of dog poop bags, and it dispenses them one by one, also clips to your leash. This is great for a dog lover. Print off the templates from my website. You can find the link in the description below. For this project, you'll need scrap fabric, a 5-inch or longer zipper, a 3/4 inch swivel hook with a D-ring bottom. These are also called lobster claw clasps, and lightweight fusible interfacing. Start by cutting out 2 dispenser sides, 2 zipper sides, and 1 tab piece. These should all be backed with interfacing before we start sewing. We're going to start with the zipper pieces. Pin 1 zipper side face down on the zipper, lining up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the zipper tape. If your zipper is long enough, put it in the middle of the zipper tape so you don't hit the zipper pull while you're sewing. Pin that on and sew as close to the zipper teeth as you can. Now repeat with the other side of the fabric, making sure they're lined up on the zipper tape at the same place. Open up the fabric and press. Then top stitch along the fabric about 1/8 inch from the seams. To create the tab, fold under 1/4 inch on the long edges of the tab piece, then fold in half to match up at the folded edges. Top stitch on the edges 1/8 inch from the folds. Fold the tab around the swivel hook to create a loop. Pin the swivel tab to the bottom of the zipper and baste it in place with the edges of the tab hanging over about 1/4 inch from the other fabric. Trim off the excess fabric and excess zipper tape. Now set this side of the dispenser to the side. We're going to make the dispenser opening on the other side using our 2 dispenser pieces. Pin both of the dispenser side pieces together with right sides together. Use your pattern piece to draw lines where we're going to sew. Use a fabric marker to draw where we're going to sew our lines. This will give us an opening for the bags to come out. Sew the pieces together along the lines, backstitching where the stitching meets the opening. Now when you fold those pieces back, you can see that there is a hole in the middle of our bag piece. Top stitch around that opening if you want, about 1/8 inch all the way around. Now we're ready to assemble the dog bag dispenser. Place the dispenser side face down on the zipper side. Open the zipper enough to be enclosed within the bag. Make sure the swivel hook is also safely enclosed. Now pin the bag together at the sides, top and bottom. We're going to sew along all of those straight edges, leaving the corner cutouts open. Cut off the excess zipper and trim down your seam allowances just a little bit. Now we're going to give the bag dimension by pinching the corners. With the bag still inside out, hold it up and pinch the corners so that they are perpendicular to the side seams. Sew along the pinched edge 1/4 inch from the raw edges, making sure to backstitch at both ends of the stitching. Repeat for all 4 sides. Now flip your little bag right side out through the zipper opening. Insert your roll of bags and you're ready for a walk. You can never have enough scrunchies, so grab your scraps and let's sew some stocking stuffers. First, cut a strip of fabric 4 by 19 inches. We're also going to need a safety pin and elastic. I like braided elastic best for this. I didn't have a 1/4 inch braided elastic, so I'm using a thicker one. I also like the soft elastic for more of a soft scrunchie, but the braided elastic will hold your hair better. Cut a piece of elastic about 8 inches long. Now we're going to start assembling the scrunchie by folding the fabric in half with right sides together lengthwise. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to turn this right side out using our safety pin. So clip your safety pin on that crease of the fold, and then use that to thread the fabric through itself. Now press the tube with the seam on the back. Press under a 1/4 inch on one of the short edges. This will give us a nice finish for our scrunchie. So just flip that edge in and fold 1/4 inch down and then press it to keep it in place. Now we're going to grab our safety pin and clip it to the elastic. Use the safety pin to thread it through the elastic. Once you have both ends, take that safety pin off and we're going to tie these in a double knot. Really tight. We want to make sure this is super tight before we tuck it in. Clip off any extra, and then we're going to tuck the elastic into the scrunchie and then overlap the folded edge over the top of the other edge, and then line it up, and we're going to sew this and back stitch. And then your scrunchie is done. These hand sanitizer keychains are so fun and hold a travel size hand sanitizer. You're going to need scraps for the outside fabric backed with interfacing, lining fabric, 1/2 inch bias tape that's single fold, a swivel clip, and cam snaps. You'll also need a way to mark your fabric and quilt basting spray. Use the pattern piece to mark the opening where our hand sanitizer top's going to go. And then we're going to lay the main fabric down on the lining fabric and pin around those markings. Adjust your stitch length down to 2 millimeters and sew around the rectangle, pivoting at the corners. Now grab your scissors and clip into the rectangle, focusing on the corners. Trim off the extra seam allowance and then make sure to clip those corners so we get a really nice straight rectangle. Now we're going to turn this right side out by pushing one layer through that hole so that we get the layers wrong sides together. Give it a good press, focusing on the rectangle. Now you can test it out with your hand sanitizer. Now we're going to finish this straight edge, which will be right here on the hand sanitizer holder. So you can decide which fabric you want on the outside at this point. We are going to fold under these edges 1/4 inch each and press. Make sure they're lined up really well, and then we're going to sew these together with a top stitch. Once that edge is finished, we're going to finish the other side, which will be the top flap. First, fold the pouch so that the rectangle at the bottom matches up and is symmetrical, and then we're going to mark the two sides at the top. These markings are going to show us where to put the bias tape so that we get it all the way around the top flap. So you're going to start putting the bias tape on right over. We're going to sandwich over the 2 layers of fabric, starting about 1/2 inch past that mark. First though, we're going to spray baste this. Spray baste will give it a little stickiness, and that'll help us hold the bias tape as we put it on around that curve. So spray it a little bit, and then we're just going to sandwich those layers of fabric, focusing on keeping that curve nice and smooth. Once you get the bias tape past that other mark, trim it off, and then we're going to top stitch around this real close to the edge of the bias tape. We're almost ready to assemble, but first we need to do the little tab that will hold our swivel clip on. So take your tab piece and fold in the long sides and then press. They should meet in the middle, and then fold them in half again and then top stitch the strip to keep it together. Now we're ready to assemble, so grab your swivel clip and thread it on and fold in half, matching those ends. Then we're going to fold our bag inside out and make sure to match up the bottom rectangle. Pin the sides of the pouch to hold it together, and then before we sew, we're going to stick the keychain swivel tab in. So we want this about a ½ inch from the top edge of that fabric flap, but we want it to be on the inside of what we're doing right now. So I like to kind of decide where we're going to put it while it's turned inside out, and then pick up that flap and put it right under there and pin. Now we're going to sew from the top flap all the way down on both sides with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure you backstitch really well at the top and the bottom of each of those seams. Next, we're going to pinch the bottom edges, so put your hand into that pouch while it's still inside out. We're just going to make a little bit of dimension by pinching the edge and sewing across it. So perpendicular to your side seam, you're going to want to pinch and create that triangle, and then you can pin it and mark 3/8 inch from the point of the triangle and draw a line across. Repeat on the other side and then sew across those lines, back stitching well. When you're done, you can trim off the extra fabric. Now turn the pouch right side out. The last step is to add a cam snap. So fold your flap over and mark a little spot for the first cam snap. I like to just push that in and then add the backing, and then we'll use this first snap to find the placement for the second. If you've never used cam snaps before, these are super fun and easy to place. Once you have the first one in, fold over the flap again to get the right placement and push down on that cam snap really well so that it leaves a mark where the next one should go. So I like to push it down, find the mark on your fabric, and then use a marker or chalk to mark the point. The mason jar pincushion with a sewing kit inside is a great gift for a college student, and it makes the perfect little sewing kit to stash wherever you need it. You can use any size mason jar for this. If you're using a regular size, use the small template. There's also a wide mouth template. We need interfacing, fabric, and some ribbon is optional, and fiber fill stuffing for this project. I love cluster fiber fill stuffing. First, fuse interfacing to the back of your fabric, and then we're going to cut out one layer from the template. Sew around the circle about 1/4 inch from the edge with a base stitch, and then grab your lid to your mason jar and pull those stitches around until the size of the fabric matches the size of the metal. Use a glue gun to carefully glue that on to the metal lid. Use sewing clips to hold the fabric on as it dries. Keep gluing until you get close to where you started, but leave an opening for stuffing. Grab some fiber fill stuffing and stuff this pincushion to your liking. Once it's done, glue the remaining piece of fabric on there to hold all that stuffing in. Be careful not to burn your fingers. Now put just a little bit of glue in the ring of the mason jar around that edge and shove the pincushion in and tighten it around your jar until it's dry. Now you have a pincushion on top and a container inside for holding all your little sewing supplies. This makes such a great gift. You can give them to college students or anyone who needs a sewing kit on the go. Let's make a travel tissue holder. This is so colorful because you can use 4 fabrics on the top, and it dispenses tissues one by one, so you always have them handy. Click the link in the description below to download this template or use the measurements 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. You're also going to need a little piece of ribbon and fabric scraps. We are going to start by picking out 6 different fabrics and giving them a little bit of a press so that they are nice and ready for us to cut with our template. I love having a template for this because you can make sure that your scrap is big enough without having to measure. You can see that I'm lining these layers of fabric up at the top left. That way I can cut these out multiple layers at a time. Once you've cut out all 6 layers, Choose 2 for the lining and the backing of your tissue holder, and the other 4 will go on the top of our tissue holder. Now we're going to press 2 of these rectangles lengthwise. So fold them in half, meet the long sides together and press. And then with the other 2, we are going to fold them in half the other way, so crosswise, and press. Now we're going to start assembling the tissue holder. First, take your ribbon and cut about 4 or 5 inches to create a loop. And then we're going to set this aside. We'll slip it in there later. Now grab your 2 unfolded pieces. We're going to decide which is going to be the lining and which will be the back of the tissue holder. So whichever one you want to be the back, lay face up. And then the one you want to be the lining will be face down on the table. So these will be wrong sides together. Now we're going to create kind of a woven stack of the folded pieces around the tissue holder. The folded edges are going to be facing into the middle of the pouch. And at this last one, I'm just picking up that last piece to get, we have an over, under kind of pattern. And in the middle, this will be where the opening is, because all those edges come together, they're not going to be sewn. So once you have that little setup, we're just going to make sure all the edges are lined up and go ahead and pin it. When you get to one of the short edges, grab your loop and we're going to put this inside of that little pouch so you see the raw edges coming out. And just pin that in there. This loop is great if you want to attach a keychain, hardware, or a swivel hook to it. So I like to lay the edges flat like that. I'm going to cover it up and just make sure all those edges are right where they should be again. Once you have that nice and pinned, we're going to sew around the entire rectangle with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We don't need to leave an opening on this project because in the center where all the folds meet, we have an opening where we can turn our pouch. Now we are going to clip the corners of this pouch and trim off the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch. And then if you want to, this is an optional step, you can finish the edges of the pouch. I am using pinking shears, which are a zigzaggy scissor that will help from fraying. You can also do a zigzag stitch, use fray check, or just leave it. So now our pouch is coming together. I'm going to turn it right side out just so you can kind of see what it looks like. It is so cute, and you can use it like this, but I'm going to show you how to make the edges a little bit boxy. This will help give it that perfect shape for the tissue holder. With the pouch inside out, slip your fingers into that corner in this inside and pinch the corner so you have a little triangle that is perpendicular to the seam allowance. And now I'm just going to put 2 little pins in there to hold that, and then sew across that about 1/2 inch from the point of the triangle. And I always like to backstitch at least once, usually twice. And that will give us that really nice little shape. It just gives a little dimension to the pouch. Now trim that seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch and then repeat on the other 3 corners. Now turn your tissue holder right side out and then open up those folds, and you can stick a mini travel tissue pack right inside of there. These are perfect for sniffle season. I am going to stash this one in my car. You can also add a keychain and put it on a backpack. You only need a few fun charm squares for this project, and it makes a bold, beautiful pot holder that you can give to neighbors and friends. We are going to need 4 charm squares for this project, and then a scrap of fabric for the back of the pot holder and some fabric for the binding. We're also going to need batting. I like to use needled batting. For this, we're going to use 2 layers. Also grab a can of spray base, and then we're ready to get started. Start by picking one of your squares to be the middle of the pot holder. We're going to leave that one whole, then pick 2 squares to be the sides. I'm going to use these 2 striped ones, and we are going to cut these in half so that we have 4 rectangles. Use a ruler to measure 2.5 inches and then just slice these in half. And then with your last square, we're going to cut this into quarters. So cut it in half with the 2.5 inches and then cut it in half again to give you 4 squares. Now we are going to lay these out. I like to put the rectangles across from each other, and then we're going to put those little squares in the corners. I laid mine out in vertical rows, and we're going to go ahead and sew each of these little sections together. Once you're done, pull them over to your pressing station. We are going to press the seam allowances in opposite directions. So for the 2 side pieces, I am pressing the seam allowances into the middle And for the middle piece, I'm pressing the seam allowances out. Now we're going to flip the middle piece over and sew these together. Before you sew, we are going to make sure the seam allowances are nested together. That means they're going to be butting up against each other, one going one way and the other going the other. Sew both sides on, and then we're going to bring it back to our pressing mat and press these open. Now grab your batting. We're going to do 2 layers of batting, so I'm just going to fold this in half so I have 2 layers. Then I'm going to put my patchwork on top and give this a rough cut around the edges just so that this batting is out of my way as I'm working with it. Now get your backing fabric. I'm going to give this a quick press and put it right behind my little sandwich. So I have the backing fabric face down, 2 layers of batting, and then my patchwork face up, and we are going to spray baste all of these layers together. So you'll have to just peel them up, spray underneath, and then lay them back down, smoothing them out as you go. I like to use 2 layers of batting because I don't like to burn my hands, and I feel like 1 layer of batting is just not enough for a potholder with hot pans. Now cut off that excess backing fabric to get it out of our way, and now we're going to top stitch this to give it a quilted look. You can really use any top stitching pattern you want, but for this project I like to top stitch 1/4 inch from the seams. So on each side I'm going to sew down 1/4 inch along the seam and then flip it around and sew down the other side. And this will just help our fabrics kind of pop out from the rest of the fabrics and give it a cool look. After you have finished that, we're going to bring it to our cutting mat and trim it down. So we're just going to square this up with the patchwork. And then when that is done, the last step is to add our binding. I am using 2.5 inch binding for this project. You just need to make sure you have enough to go all the way around the potholder, plus a little bit extra for a loop. So if you need to sew multiple strips together, go ahead and do that. Then press the strips in half lengthwise. And now we're going to start sewing this on. I like to start sort of near a corner, and we're going to give it a few inches and start sewing on with 3/8 inch seam allowance. Sew down one side until you are 3/8 inches away from the edge, and then stop and pull your potholder out of the sewing machine. And now we're going to fold the binding up to create this triangle. So we're going to line up that fold with the top of the potholder and then keep sewing on 3/8 inch. That'll give us that nice corner that we can turn later. When you get back to where you started, we are going to finish off this binding by turning it down to create a triangle and then trimming off the excess fabric. This is just a simple way to finish off the binding on a small project. I don't do this on quilts, but since we're just making a potholder, we just want it to be quick, so we are going to just trim that off and then repeat that same thing for the other side. So overlap it a little, and then we're going to fold it up to create that triangle shape. That way we have 2 nicely finished edges. To create a loop, grab an extra piece of binding about 5 or 6 inches long, fold the short edges into the middle and press, and then fold the entire thing in half lengthwise again and press to secure. Then top stitch along those edges 1/8 inch from the folds, and we're going to just find a little corner spot to sew that into. So what I'm going to do is flip the binding back and then just follow the stitching line that I already have there to secure the loop. And now we're going to go ahead and flip the binding to the back and use a hand needle and thread to do an invisible stitch along the binding to secure it to the back. This stitch is a really discreet way to attach binding, and it looks so good when it's finished. When you get to the corner, I like to use the needle to kind of help me create an angle of a triangle along that corner. And then you can either stitch down into the corner or just secure that little spot at the top and then keep sewing the binding on. Stitch right over the loop and keep attaching the binding until you have finished the entire potholder. Now your potholder is done and ready for baking. If you have a bookworm you're sewing for, this reading pillow is a must. It has a pocket that you can stick a book in, which is so fun because you can wrap it up with a book already inside. First, cut a main piece 20 inches by 20 inches. Then cut a pocket 12 by 20 inches, and then 2 backs also 12 by 20 inches. The back pieces will overlap to create an opening. Each piece also needs a corresponding lining piece of the same size. Back all your main pieces with lightweight fusible interfacing. This will make it crisp but still soft. We're also going to need a piece 4 inches by 10 inches for the handle. Make sure you've backed this with interfacing, and then we'll assemble it first. Start by pressing your handle in half to create a crease in the middle. Then open it up and fold the long edges into the crease. Press well. Now fold that part in half and press again to create the handle. Pin the handle and then top stitch both sides 1/8 inch from the edges. Once your handle is done, we're going to set it aside for later. Now we're going to assemble the pocket. So lay the lining on top of the main pocket piece and line it up at the top. Sew across the top with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then once you've sewn that seam, open it up and press the seam allowance towards the lining. Now we're going to top stitch the lining fabric 1/8 inch from the main fabric. You'll sew the seam allowance at the same time. This is called understitching, and it makes it really easy to fold over. So fold over your fabrics and then press it well. Now we're going to do an official top stitch on the main fabric, 1/8 inch from the edge. Grab your back pieces and the back linings. We're going to do the exact same thing we did with the pocket with both of these backs. Once that is done, we are ready to assemble our pillow, so give everything a good press. Lay your main front piece on the main lining, and then grab the pocket and line it up with the bottom of the front main piece. Now pin these pieces all together to hold them in place and baste around the whole square. Once you've basted it, remove the pins. Now fold the top in half and crease the top. This is just so we know where the middle is when we put the handle on. Pick up your handle and measure 2 inches from that crease on either side. This is where our handle is going to go, but we're going to pin it upside down so that it's inside the pillow when we sew it. That way it'll be outside the pillow when we turn it right side out. Use your sewing machine to baste the ends of the handle to keep it in place. To finish the assembly, grab your back piece and lay it face down on the front. Then grab the other back and lay it down overlapping, lined up with the side of the front piece. Once they're lined up, pin all the way around. Then sew around the entire pillow with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you're done, we're going to clip the corners to give it a nice shape on the outside. Just trim off that seam allowance a bit. Then flip it right side out. Use a chopstick or a point turner to get the corners turned out. Then give it a final press and you're ready to put your insert inside. Now find a fun book and stick it in the front pocket. This accordion zipper pouch is a cool 6-pocket zipper pouch that has different sections for different things. It is a perfect makeup bag for teens, girls, and anyone who loves to sort. This zipper pouch is a great way to organize your sewing supplies. Keep everything in its own section.
First, grab the free pattern from my website, the link's in the description, or you can use measurements listed below. You'll need 6 different fabrics for this pouch. Use the main pattern piece to cut out 2 of each. We're going to back these with lightweight fusible interfacing. Cut out 12 main pieces with your lining fabric. These will be linings for all 6 of the bags.
cut out 2 handle pieces and fuse interfacing to the back. The first step is to mark the lining pieces. We're going to mark the stitching lines where we're going to stitch these pouches together. We're going to do this before we sew anything because it'll be much easier now. There are 2 stitching templates included. One is easier for beginners. The easier one will give you a little bit more room to sew when you're sewing on your sewing machine. So connect all those lines and then do that for all of your lining pieces. Now we're going to assemble the handles. First, fold them in half lengthwise and press. Then unfold and fold both long edges into the crease to meet in the middle. That first crease is just to help us get these right in the middle. Now fold those in half on top of each other to create the handle. Press that well, and then we're going to top stitch along the top and the bottom of that strip about 1/8 inch from the edges. When that is done, we're going to fold under the short edges of the handles 3/4 inch. So I like to use a ruler to help me. So fold it over at the 3/4 inch line and then press well. And repeat that for all 4 of those handle edges. And then when those are done, we're going to set them aside for now. Before you jump in, make sure you have the zippers and fabrics that you want. I like to set them up the way I'm going to sew them together and match my zippers to each fabric. So grab your first fabric and your first pouch. We're going to put the zipper face down on that fabric, and then on top of that, we'll put the lining lined up right at the top of that zipper tape. Make sure your fabrics are aligned at the zipper on the right spot and then pin it up. Now we're going to sew. You don't need a zipper foot for this project. You can use your regular presser foot, but align the needle all the way to the left as you sew through this. Once you're done with that, flip up the lining, and we're going to flip the zipper tape underneath the main fabric and press it well. Then go ahead and top stitch 1/8 inch from that fabric. Butt the presser foot up against the zipper teeth and move the needle so it's 1/8 inch over that fabric before you sew. Once that's done, we're just going to press the lining out of the way so that it doesn't get caught up in the zipper teeth. And then we're going to do the other side. The other side is made the same way. So we're going to put the main fabric on the zipper right side down, lining that up with the fabric below. So you want it to be aligned in the same spot of that on that zipper. Then grab your lining and put it behind, making that sandwich. Pin it up, sew it, and then do the same top stitching treatment you did with the other side. Once that's done, we're going to open our zipper part way and fold the main fabrics to the main fabric so you have right sides together, and the lining to the lining so you have the linings right side together. Then we're going to pin all the way around. When you're pinning the zipper, pin it toward the lining. On the other end, make sure the zipper teeth are also toward the lining. And then we're going to sew all the way around this, leaving about 3 inches at the bottom of the lining. Once that's done, we're going to trim off the corners of the main fabric and trim off that extra zipper teeth. Now turn it right side out and press it well. When you get to the bottom lining, we're going to align that opening so that the seam allowance is straight. Press it really well and top stitch 1/8 inch from the edge. Once that's done, we're going to press that into our zipper pouch. We're going to want to give our zipper pouch a nice press since we're going to be handling it a lot later. And that's your first zipper pouch. So now is a good time to pause the video and make the rest of your 6 zipper pouches. Once you have them all ready, put them in a stack in the order you want them to be in your accordion pouch. And then grab a handle. We're going to put that on the top and the very back zipper pouch. I like to keep my stack of pouches together when I'm not using them so that they stay in the right order and right alignment. Center that handle on the front. Now we're going to sew around the ends, creating a rectangle about 1 inch around. So put that in your sewing machine and make sure you pivot at each of the corners. I also recommend back stitching on this step or going over it at least 2 times. Now you have your handle on your front side. We're going to do the same on the back. So I like to put that back on my stack and then turn it over and grab the back pouch. We're going to put it on the other side of the back one. Once that's done, we're ready to sew these all together. If your fabric marker disappeared or if you didn't mark the inside stitching lines like I did, we can do it now. So we're going to put that template inside and measure about a little less than 1 3/4 inch from the top of that fabric, and that's where we're going to mark those corners. Once the corners are marked, you can turn it right side out and draw those lines. When that's done, turn it right side out, and then I'm going back to my stack to grab my second pouch. I like to put it back on that stack just to make sure the zipper's in the right order and direction. So I'm going to take those first 2 pouches and we're going to sew these together. Line up the pouches at the bottoms, making sure all the sides are straight and aligned, and then we're going to pin them together over those lines that we just drew. When all your pins are in, we're going to take it to our sewing machine, and this is the trickiest part, so be patient with yourself. We are going to stick that in the machine and make sure you're using your needle alignment to help you. The closer to the left it's aligned, the easier it's going to be. I also recommend backstitching at the corners because those points are going to be a little bit vulnerable. All right, once that's done, clip up your threads and we have the first 2 ready to go. You can see how nice it looks. So we're going to take this back to the stack, grab the 3rd one, and repeat the same process over again. This gets a little trickier as you add each pouch because you're just working with a kind of a bulky project, but to help you, you can sew that rectangle in sections, remove it, and smooth over to make sure you're not puckering, and use your needle alignment function to help you. This crayon roll up is a wonderful stocking stuffer and great gift for kids. You can put crayons in it so they have a fresh batch of crayons and a super neat way to store and hold them for travel. Find the templates for this project on my website. We're going to need 3 fabrics, 1-inch ribbon, and also lightweight fusible interfacing. Start by cutting out 2 main pieces with your 2 different fabrics, and then back 1 with interfacing. Now we're going to cut out the pocket pattern piece. This has 2 fold lines, so we're going to first fold our fabric in half. You can see this is a folded edge right here, so I have it folded in half one way, and then we're going to fold it in half again the opposite way. This will give us a corner with 2 folds, so we're going to place that pocket pattern piece right up against those 2 folds. Cut that pattern piece out and then open up your folded fabric to reveal your pocket piece. Fold that pocket piece in half lengthwise and press. Then match the bottom and the corners of the pocket piece with the main lining piece. Pin and sew around the bottom edges to keep it in place. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew to attach this pocket piece on the sides and the bottom. Now we're going to use a ruler and a fabric marker to mark the lines for stitching each crayon pocket. This roll can fit up to 18 crayons. We're going to use our fabric marker to draw lines that we'll stitch over to create each spot for the crayons. The first one will be 1.5 inches from the starting edge. This will be the widest line we're drawing because we have to account for the seam allowance on the side of the roll. Draw the rest of the lines 1 inch from the first line. If you're making this for jumbo crayons, increase the width of each pocket to 1.5 inches. After you've drawn the lines, we are going to sew over the line, top stitching at the very top where the folded edge of the pocket piece is. Sew down to the bottom. Repeat for each line. After you've sewn those lines, we just need to finish the crayon case, starting by adding the ribbon to the side. Measure out 28 inches of ribbon, and if you want to, finish the ends of the ribbon with a 45-degree angle to prevent fraying. Fold the ribbon in half, and we're going to pin it to the left side of the crayon roll. Now grab your second fabric and put it face down on top of this. Pin all the way around the edges. Now sew around the crayon roll with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving a 2-inch opening at the top. Clip the corners and trim your seam allowance down. Then turn it right side out. The last step is to close the opening we left. Give this crayon roll a really good press, making sure to get those edges lined up. Then top stitch along the entire crayon roll around 1/8 inch from the edges. Now your crayon roll is ready to use. Let me know in the comments which gifts you're sewing first, and check out this video for more great sewing.